The call came in just as I was finishing lunch. A club sandwich from the diner right down the road. Its greasy wrapping paper still sitting in the passenger seat of my truck. Dispatch said it was a standard tow, some guy named Stan with a busted down sedan in the outskirts of the city. He needed a lift to his place a couple of towns over. Simple enough. I've been driving for nearly 15 years at this point, and jobs like this were my bread and butter. Stan was waiting near a gas station when I pulled up, leaning against his car like he'd been there all day long. His vehicle, a battered up old Chevy with peeling paint and one busted headlight, looked as tired as he did. Stan himself wasn't much to look at, mid-40s, thinning hair under a sweat-stained baseball cap, and this cheap leather jacket that creaked every time he moved. "Hey," I called out through the open window. "You Stan?" "That's me," he said, pushing himself off the car. He walked over and stuck a hand out. "Appreciate you coming out so quick. I figured it'd take a lot longer to get somebody out here." "No problem." I shook his hand. It was rough and calloused, like he'd spent most of his life working with tools. "What's the issue with the car over there?" "Engine's shot," he said, nodding towards his Chevy. "It started making this weird knocking noise a few miles back and then just up and died on me. Figured I'd rather tow it back home than pay some shop in the city to rip me off." I nodded in response. Made sense. People in Stan's situation didn't usually have a lot of cash to spare, and a mechanic's rate would be pretty brutal. I crunched the numbers in my head. The trip out to his place would take about an hour and a half, plus the drive back, 4 hours tops including loading and unloading. $700 sound fair to you?" I said. Stan winced but nodded in return. "Fair enough. Let's get it done." I loaded the car into my flatbed and didn't take long at all. Stan just hovered nearby, watching like he thought I might scratch his paint. By the time I finally finished strapping it down, the sun was dipping into the sky. "All right, you ready?" I asked, climbing back into the cab. "Yep," he said, sliding into the passenger seat. He smelled faintly of motor oil and cigarettes, a mix that I'd grown used to over all these years. We then hit the road, heading west out of the city. That first leg of the trip was pretty uneventful, listening to the hum of my engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio, and Stan's small talk about the car, his mechanic buddy back home, and how he used to drive a truck himself before things got complicated, whatever that meant. He didn't elaborate and I didn't press. The suburbs then gave way to open fields, and the sky above us streaked with reds and purples as the sun finally set. It was pretty peaceful in a way, this quiet stretch of road with no traffic, just listening to the rhythmic thud of the tires against the asphalt. I wasn't mad about it. "Been doing this long?" Stan asked, breaking up the silence. "Long enough," I said. "It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. You know." He nodded, just staring out the window as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared below the horizon. Darkness then settled in pretty quickly, the kind that settles a lot thicker out in the middle of nowhere. My headlights cut through it, illuminating the narrow ribbon of the highway ahead. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. We still had around 50 miles to go. Stan had gone quiet now, just staring out the window. His face was half lit by the glow of the dashboard. The highway stretched on, this ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the endless darkness. Out of nowhere, Stan asked me, "Hey, you mind if we pull over for a minute?" He said suddenly. His voice was tight, like he'd almost been holding something in. Pull over?" I repeated. "Yeah, nature's calling," he said with an awkward chuckle. "I've been holding it since before you got there." I hesitated, glancing at the clock. We were making good time, but I wasn't really a big fan of stopping on the side of the highway, especially out here. Still, I guess the guy was paying me $700. A bathroom break didn't seem like too much to ask. "All right," I said, easing off the gas. I guided the truck onto the shoulder. Stan opened up the door and then climbed out, muttering a quick, "Be right back." Then he disappeared into the brush, the beam of his phone's flashlight bobbing in the darkness. I leaned back in my seat and just scrolled through my own phone, just to pass the time. A few minutes went by, and I started to wonder what was taking him so long, and that's when I heard the crunch of footsteps returning. Stan burst out of the brush, moving fast. His face was now pale and his eyes were wide. He yanked open the door and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind him. "The hell happened to you?" I asked, startled by his panic. There's somebody out there," he stammered out, locking the door immediately after. "What?" "I was out there, doing my business, and I heard this noise, like footsteps, so I look up and there's this guy just standing there watching me." "You're sure about that?" "Yeah, I'm sure," he snapped. "The hell would I make that up for?" I frowned and glanced out the window, squinting off into the darkness. I didn't really see anything. Then, just as my eyes adjusted, I spotted some movement. Someone stepping into the faint glow of the headlights. A man. He was tall and thin, clothes hanging off of him like they didn't quite fit. His face was obscured by shadow, but there was just something wrong about the way he moved. "Jesus," I muttered, my pulse quickening. "See? I told you, that's him," Stan hissed, sinking lower into his seat. I shifted into drive and my foot hovered over the gas pedal. All right, let's get the hell out of here. But then I hesitated. What if this guy was hurt, drunk, lost? My conscience kind of gnawed at me as I glanced back at the figure, now just a few yards away from us. "Think this guy's okay, or what's his deal?" I asked. "Who the hell cares? Let's go," Stan said. Before I could make a decision, the man then stepped closer, his face finally illuminated by my headlights. His skin was pale, almost gray, eyes sunken in and ringed with dark shadows. He raised one hand, holding a long, gleaming kitchen knife. My breath was caught in my throat as he tapped the blade against the passenger side window, the sound sharp and metallic. Stan just let out a strangled yelp, fumbling for the door handle. "Drive, drive!" I locked the doors with a quick press of the button, and for some reason, I don't really know why, I can't explain it to this day, I rolled the window down just an inch. "Hey!" I called out, voice kind of shaky. "Are you alright, man?" His expression remained unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low and rasping. "I need you to call the police." I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Call the police," he repeated, his voice trembling now. "Please." "Why?" The man's hand shook as he lowered the knife and held up his other arm. My stomach churned at the sight. His wrists were a mess of deep, jagged cuts, blood streaming down his arm. I came out here to end it," he said, voice breaking. "But I don't want to die anymore, please. Help me." Stan stared at him, his face a mask of horror. "This is a trap," he whispered. "He's lying, just go." But I couldn't do it. Something in the man's voice, his eyes, told me that he was telling the truth. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911. The dispatcher picked up, her calm professional tone, this stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around me. There's a man out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's hurt, he's bleeding pretty bad. We're on Highway 41, about 50 miles west of the city." "An ambulance is on its way," the dispatcher said.
Can you keep them calm till they arrive?
I'll try, I said, glancing back at the man. He had lowered the knife completely, his shoulders slumping as he leaned against the side of the truck. Hey, help is coming, man, just hold on, I told him. The man nodded, his lips trembling. Thank you, is all he whispered. Stan was still glued to his seat, his face pale as a ghost. I cannot believe you stopped, he muttered under his breath. You're gonna get us killed. Calm down, I said, though my voice betrayed my own unease. My hand was still clutching the phone pretty hard as I relayed those updates to the dispatcher. Outside, the man continued to lean against his truck. His breaths were coming in shallow and uneven, the blood pooling beneath him glistening in the faint light. Those minutes dragged on like hours, tension in the cab suffocating. I kept an eye on the man, watching for any kind of sudden movements, but he just stood there, trembling and holding his wrist like he was trying to keep himself together, literally. Off in the distance, I heard the wail of sirens. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The man then suddenly perked up, his head snapping toward the sound. They can't take me back, he muttered, shaking his head. I can't go back to town. What are you talking about? I asked, leaning closer to the window. He didn't answer. Instead, he pushed himself off the truck and then staggered back out into the darkness, clutching at his wounded arm. Hey, stop! I yelled, flinging open the door, but Stan grabbed my arm. Are you insane? Let him go. I was already out of the truck though, and I followed him. The flashlight on my phone casting the shaky beam ahead, illuminating his hunched figure as he stumbled toward the trees. Wait! The ambulance is coming! Wait! I called after. He stopped and turned to face me. In the harsh glare of the flashlight, his face looked even worse than before. Pale and now drenched with sweat, his eyes were totally batshit. You don't understand, he sobbed. You're watching me. Who the hell's watching you? What are you talking about? Before he could answer though, those sirens grew louder and closer. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance. The man recoiled as if the lights were burning him. I'm sorry, he just said, then turned and disappeared off into the woods. I stood there dumbfounded until the ambulance and the police car screeched to a halt nearby. EMTs jumped out and their faces were grim as they approached me. He just ran off into the woods, I said, pointing toward the trees. The EMTs then exchanged a glance and grabbed their gear and headed off toward him. A police officer approached me not long after. His expression was a mix of curiosity and suspicion. One of the officers went to look around with them. You, mind telling me what exactly happened here? So I explained everything to him. The tow job, the roadside stop, the man with the bleeding wrists. The officer nodded along, jotting down notes. His furrowed brow, though, told me he wasn't buying this whole story I was telling him. Eventually, Stan gets out of the truck, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Can we just go now? He said. This has ruined my whole night, man. Not yet, the officer said. We need statements from both of you. So there we stood for what felt like hours, answering questions and watching the EMTs comb the woods. And eventually they came back empty-handed. He's gone. I don't know where he went. We can't find him, one of them said, shaking his head. The officer then sighed and closed his notebook. All right, you're both free to go, but if we have more questions, we'll keep in touch. Stan and I then climbed back into the truck, the weight of that night pressing down upon us. As I pulled off back onto the highway, neither one of us spoke. When we finally reached Stan's house, he practically leapt out of the truck, mumbling a quick thanks before disappearing into the shadows himself. I watched him go, vaguely relieved to be done for the night. My drive home was pretty quiet. The road stretched endlessly before me. When I passed that pullout where it all began, I glanced towards the trees. expecting to see the man's shadowy figure lurking around there again. But I didn't. The thing I wonder about most was, what was it he didn't want to go back to? I continued to ponder and give it some thought, but I guess it probably was just the rambling of some crazy-ass dude. So there it was, staring at the clock and waiting for the night to end. Babysitting 3 kids wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but the cash was fairly decent, and the parents didn't mind if I used their fridge like my personal buffet. The oldest, Ellie, was a freshman at my high school. Her twin brothers Jack and Sam were like these hyperactive squirrels, but for the most part, they stayed out of trouble when Ellie bossed them around. It was a pretty standard night until Brenda called. Brenda and I had been best friends since 5th grade, bonding over a shared hatred of dodgeball and bad cafeteria pizza. But tonight, she wasn't calling me to gossip about the latest school drama. No, Brenda had run away from home. Again. This time though, she'd made it all the way to the city, to some grimy bus station in a sketchy part of Chicago. Her voice on the phone was shaky and panicked. She realized it was a mistake and begged me to come get her. "Please, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm really scared," she said. My stomach twisted. Brenda was never the type to admit fear, so this must be pretty serious. I glanced over at the twins, who were busy arguing over some video game and didn't even notice me. Ellie was scrolling through her phone. If I left, I'd be breaking about a dozen rules, but Brenda was my best friend. "Give me an hour," I replied to her. I bribed Ellie and the twins with the promise of ice cream. "Biggest sundaes you'll ever see, but only if you don't tell your parents." Of course, they agreed instantly, the allure of sugar far outweighing their loyalty to the babysitter's code of ethics. I grabbed my mom's car keys and ushered them outside. The plan's simple: grab Brenda, drop her off at my place, then return before her parents came home. Easy, right? Wrong. Not 20 minutes into the drive onto the freeway, no less, one of my tires exploded like a gunshot. The car swerved. Ellie screamed. I managed to wrestle it onto the shoulder, thankfully. I jumped out to inspect the damage as my heart pounded. No spare, no wallet, no phone, just a dark, empty stretch of road. But then I saw some headlights. The headlights grew larger, blinding white against the dark. A chill crawled down my spine as I saw the hulking shape of a tow truck slowing to a stop behind us. It wasn't just any tow truck either. It looked ancient, the kind that you would see in a junkyard, held together by rust and sheer determination. The cab was elevated, and the engine rumbled like a growling beast. As the driver stepped out, my stomach knotted a little tighter. He was tall and broad-shouldered with wild, greasy hair sticking out from underneath his baseball cap. But the detail that froze me in place was his hand, or rather the hook where his hand should have been. A long curved piece of metal gleamed underneath the truck's lights. A perfect pirate cliche, and somehow it looked more menacing in real life. "Need some help?" His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together, but I guess not really unkind. Ellie clutched my arm. "We don't need help. Let's just wait for somebody else," she hissed, but I could see Jack and Sam staring wide-eyed from the back seat. We really didn't have many options. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. I had a blowout and I don't have a spare. I left my wallet at the house. I can't even call a tow." The man tilted his head. His expression was unreadable inside that dim light. Then, unexpectedly, he just chuckled. "Tough night, huh? Don't worry, kid. I got a shop not far from here. I'll get you a new tire, no charge. I can't really leave you stranded out here." I hesitated. Every horror movie instinct in me screamed, "Bad idea, bad idea." But what choice did I have? "Okay, thank you," I replied. He nodded and then gestured to the car. "Get everybody in the truck and I'll hook up your car and take care of the rest." Inside, the cab was cramped and smelled faintly of oil and cigarette smoke, but at least it was warm. Ellie and I sat on the passenger seat while the twins squished inside the middle, whispering nervously to one another. The driver climbed in, that hook tapping the door frame as he settled behind the wheel. "Name's Denny," he said, flicking a switch to lift the car onto the tow rig. "What are you kids doing out here anyway?" I mumbled something about picking up my friend, and he didn't seem to press, just nodded and turned up the CB radio. Static crackled, followed by a voice announcing traffic updates and some weather reports. We merged onto the freeway, the car swaying slightly behind us. Denny seemed pretty calm, even friendly, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking at that hook. It glinted every time he adjusted the wheel. His free hand occasionally twitched, drumming on the dashboard. About 10 minutes into the drive, the radio crackled to life. This time it wasn't any kind of traffic updates. It was a voice and it cut through the static, gruff and urgent. "Denny, you there? It's Roy. You gotta get home, man. She's at it again." Denny stiffened. His grip seemed to tighten on the wheel. "The hell are you talking about, Roy?" "You know damn well, I just saw her with Jimmy at the bar. They left together. Figured you want to know." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the engine. Then Denny slammed his fist against the dashboard. The whole truck jolted. "Son of a bitch!" he roared, his voice filling up the cab. The twins shrank back and Ellie clutched my arm so hard that it hurt. I tried to keep my voice steady. Denny, maybe we could just pull over?" "Not now," he barked back. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror and then to the road ahead. "I gotta take care of something." The tow truck roared to life, speeding up. My heart continued to hammer as we swerved through lanes, the car behind us bouncing dangerously. "Denny, please, there's kids in here," I shouted, but he wasn't listening. His face was a mask of rage, his knuckles white on the wheel. We careened off the freeway and then into a residential area, the streets narrowing as houses blurred past us. All the while, Denny was muttering under his breath, something about betrayal, about teaching her a lesson. Finally, he screeched to a halt outside this small house, had peeling paint and a yard littered with old car parts. Killed the engine and yanked open the glove box, pulling out a revolver. My blood ran cold. "Stay here," he growled. "Don't move." He slammed the car door behind him and stalked towards the house. We just sat there frozen, too scared to breathe. Then came the shouting. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Denny's voice boomed, followed by a woman's scream. Gunshots shattered through the air, 3 deafening cracks. Ellie was the first to move, grabbing my arm. "We have to get out of here now." We scrambled out of the truck, dragging the twins with us. Across the street was a beat-up sedan, and I motioned for us to hide behind it. But as we ducked behind the car, a shadow moved inside. A man's face appeared in the window, his eyes wide with panic. He wasn't hiding, he was trying to hotwire the car. "The hell out of here," he hissed. "You won't be caught in this." The sound of glass breaking made us all freeze. Denny was back outside, gun in hand, scanning the street. "The hell are you, Jimmy?" he bellowed out. The man in the car swore under his breath and threw the door open. "I'm not sticking around for this," he said. Then he bolted down the street, slowly disappearing into the shadows. I grabbed the twins and Ellie and we ran in the opposite direction, ducking between houses and through backyards. My legs burned and my chest heaved, but I didn't stop until we were several blocks away. Only then did I pull out Ellie's phone and dial 911. We huddled together under a dim glow of flickering streetlights, waiting for the police. Every sound made me jump. A distant dog barking, the crunch of leaves. The kids were pale and silent, their earlier chatter and energy completely drained now by fear. Ellie was clung to my arm the whole time, her phone trembling in her hands. Jack and Sam were crouched low, whispering about the gunshots. A squad car arrived faster than I expected. 2 officers stepped out and their expressions were grim as I tried to explain what had taken place. I fumbled through the story about Denny, the tow truck, the gunshots, my words tumbling over one another. They both exchanged this look that I couldn't quite read before one of them asked us to wait by the car while they checked out the scene. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. When the officers returned, their faces were even graver. We've found him," one of them said, "and the woman. It looks like they didn't make it." I swallowed hard, nausea rising up in my throat. Denny was dead. That friendly guy who stopped to help us, whose biggest crime had seemed to be a bad temper, was now lying lifeless in that crumbling house. The officers didn't give us any more details, but his tone suggested there was nothing peaceful about it. "And what about the guy in the car?" Ellie asked, her voice very small. "The one trying to steal it." The officers just shook their head. "He's long gone. We couldn't find him, probably wanted no part in whatever the hell was going down here." We weren't allowed to leave just yet. The cops called a second tow truck to take my mom's car to a nearby shop. While we waited, more squad cars arrived, followed by an ambulance. The neighborhood came to life with flashing lights and murmuring neighbors. It felt surreal, like I was literally watching somebody else's nightmare. Finally, an officer gave us a ride back home to the babysitting house. The kids' parents returned not long after that, shocked but relieved that everybody was okay. I never really told them the full story about how close we'd come to something way worse. But after that, I couldn't sleep for weeks, haunted by the memory of Denny's rage and the crack of those gunshots in the night. Around 2 years ago, I worked with a tow truck company. When I got the job, I was pretty thrilled because it had me working at night. That way, I wouldn't have to miss much more of my college classes during the day. Time went on and I got to see some pretty messed up stuff that most people really wouldn't want to see doing this job. You never truly realize just how much crazy people drive right on by. Twisted metal, dangerous chemicals, blood and guts, all kinds of stuff. Sometimes that little accident you drove past actually has a dead body in the mix. I went to a lot of accidents to pick up the vehicles and saw a lot of blood and seriously injured people. Out of all my stories though, there is one night that it's hard to shake, one that still haunts me now and again when I think back on it. You have to remember, when I first started, I really didn't know what I was getting into. Hell, back then even, I was kind of excited to see that crazy stuff. I wanted a high adrenaline, shock factor type of job. It happened on a normal Friday night. Me and my partner Rodney were sitting at the station, playing some cards and just waiting for a call to come in. Around 12:30 a.m. we got a call. Head-on collision with a semi. Needs to get the semi towed away ASAP. We rushed out of the station and made our way to the scene of the accident, which I'd say was around a 30-minute drive. I know it sounds weird, but me and Rodney were kind of excited that there was a call because, well, we'd been sitting there for hours. Nothing was happening and both of us were on the verge of falling asleep, which, for obvious reasons, was kind of a big no-no on the job. When we got to the scene, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. A small Chevy Sonic with one female passenger had hit the semi straight on. I think I heard she either fell asleep or was intoxicated at the time. When you roll up on a call like this, it's usually one way or the other. Innocent people that ran into trouble or trouble-making people that create issues for every driver around them. Either way, I start walking towards the semi to hook up the chains. I glanced at the car and it was already empty. The windshield was almost completely missing. There was practically no blood, which was weird for this type of accident. I asked the police officer nearby for some more information. He said the girl had gotten thrown out of the windshield, literally smashed into pieces. They'd found everything but her head, and they were looking for it as we spoke. Ever since I arrived on scene, I've had to go to the bathroom, but so far I'd just been holding it. Eventually, I didn't have really any other choice but to just go. I told my partner I'm going to take a couple steps into the field right next to us. I'd be right back. I went off into the field, started doing my business. After I zipped up and finished, I noticed the mirror of the car about 10 meters further in. Decided to just go grab it while I was out there. I grabbed the mirror and started to turn around, but something else caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. I looked back and saw a man standing there. It was too dark out to make much out more than his silhouette. He seemed to be in his 40s, tall, and had this weird look on his face. Excuse me, sir, are you okay? I said, thinking maybe this guy witnessed the accident or maybe was even part of it. I got no response. Now, this is where I noticed something really weird about this guy. He was holding something in his hand. It looked like a wig, maybe even a mask or something similar. Again, I couldn't make out too many details because of how dark it was around me, and the corn that was in the way too. "Hey Rodney, come over here," I shouted. I was actually starting to get kind of freaked out now. That guy was just standing there not saying anything. Then all of a sudden he held out his hand. The one that was holding the mask, which I thought was a mask at the time. I stared at it only to find out that it wasn't a mask. It was that poor girl's head he was holding. I don't know how I knew this considering I've never seen the girl, but really there was no other explanation in that situation. I stood there frozen, just staring. I felt like I was about to get sick. Surely I was going to throw up, but I just stood there. After a while, I finally snapped out of it and turned around to yell, "Rodney!" I yelled for him as loud as I could. I turned back immediately, and in typical horror movie fashion, he was gone. Now, if he would have ran away, I would have saw the corn move, saw at least something, but there was nothing. He was just gone. I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned around to see Rodney standing there. "Where the fuck have you been, dude?" "What do you mean? I've been yelling for you. What the hell took you so long?" I don't believe what I fucking just saw, man. "Dude, you've been gone for almost 2 hours. We had everybody looking for you. What happened?" 2 hours? It felt like it had been 5 minutes, 10 minutes max. I had no explanation. And that wasn't the weirdest thing. I was on the other side of the field, not by the road anymore. That would have been an easy 15-minute walk, and I don't remember taking a step after seeing that guy. I quickly explained my story to Rodney and even the police officer. They claimed to never saw or found anybody around the area, and they never found the head of that girl either. To this day, I don't have any explanation for what happened, as crazy as it sounds. I've had plenty of theories thrown at me, and most likely I think it's this. I saw something that I was not prepared to see, so my mind and body went into full shock, like for real. I saw that guy holding a head, quickly realizing what I was looking at, and then wandered around that cornfield in a stupor as my brain just did backflips, trying to process everything. I later learned it's pretty common for people experiencing trauma to dissociate until their mind can collect itself and accept the trauma around it. Again, I'm not sure if that's actually what happened to me, but that's the only scenario that makes sense. How else can I just lose 2 hours like that? My story takes place a long time ago, way before cell phones were even relevant. I was a mother in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The Macon, Georgia doctor's office was around an hour away from our home, and I was just taking the two youngest of my three. Around then, they were 1 and 3 years old, to the scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, the office would give us the last 2 appointments of the day, which I was very grateful for. The doctor had just built this new building off of a fresh spur of the highway, so the location was isolated in pretty much every direction. But it was a very nice facility, especially compared to the old spot. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot, and my car, a black Jeep Cherokee that we'd owned for 2 years, was one of the only 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot once we arrived. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from the car seats, and then for the next hour or so, we waited, saw the doctor, paid, then finally exited back outside to the vehicle. My car was the only one left in the lot, as I loaded up my children in their car seats for the trip home. I watched as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, and of course, in typical fashion, my car now wouldn't start when I turned the key. It was just an odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the door until somebody allowed us back in and asked to borrow their phone to hopefully get a hold of some kind of nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book, and the man said he would come, but it might be a little while. I gave him my location, then headed back out to the car. I rolled down the windows, loaded the children back into their seats as we waited once more. Soon we watched as all the lights were turned off in the building. Everybody left, their cars departing one by one, leaving us now alone inside that parking lot. It was still light out, and I spent most of the time trying to tend to the children, digging through our cars for snacks and a bottle, making sure they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant on the phone said it would probably be a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot. A man got out of his pickup, smiled, and nodded to me. He said he was going to raise up the hood. He was this middle-aged man, bit scruffy, and quite frankly, many gas station attendants sometimes kind of look this way, especially at the end of a workday. I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. I sat down again in the driver's seat, my car door now open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine. But he seemed to be taking a long time checking those connections. I just wanted him to grab some jumper cables, yet he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong with it. And he said, "Oh, it's just a loose wire. It's not the battery." Then continued on with whatever he was doing. I couldn't really see his face from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through that long horizontal slit that's between the windshield and the raised hood. More than once, he said it was merely a loose wire, and then asked me if I would just come up here really quickly. He'd show me which one it was, so it could never happen again. I remember kind of smiling to myself, shaking my head, saying that sadly there was no reason to show me any of that. I definitely didn't know anything about cars. I thanked him and shook my head. I wasn't going to do that. There's no sense. Just continued waiting for that inevitable sign that, hey, start the engine. Surely at any moment it was coming now, right? At this point, I remember thinking he was definitely flirting with me as he spoke, but I was trying above all else to be polite and kind, as he was indeed helping us. We were hot, tired, and miserable. Truthfully, throughout this time he was here, I was distracted with tending to my kids. Oddly enough, he was starting to sound like he was getting a little frustrated with me because I wouldn't come up and look at the engine. I remember thinking vaguely that I didn't want to make him mad, especially if he was just going to leave us here all alone. The sun was now sinking pretty quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck pulls into that desolate parking lot. As it did, the man working underneath my hood suddenly slams it shut, runs to his truck and started it up, then drove away very quickly. Didn't even say a word, not goodbye, not nothing. I was confused and a little anxious when he did this because I didn't know who this new truck was that was now arriving. I remember feeling a little frightened that he suddenly left me there all alone with two little ones, defenseless. Why couldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever it was? That definitely would have been the Sutherland gentleman thing to do. I glanced around and was now very aware once again that there was no visible cars on the road, no homes, no businesses nearby, and the sun was quickly fading. Also, this new, unmarked pickup pulled in next to me. I got out of the car once again, this time a lot more apprehensively. Upon exiting though, he immediately introduces himself. His name and voice seemed to match who I'd spoken to on the phone much earlier that day. He actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road, then asked me, who's that guy that just left so fast? Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and told him, well, I don't know. All this time I thought he was you. We both just laughed slightly. Then he grabbed jumper cables, walked to the front end of my car, raised the hood, and began to work. I fell back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with luck, the air conditioner would be blowing full blast shortly. While listening for those all too familiar words, "try it," I had my back completely turned towards the children, when he surprised me by suddenly coming up to the driver's side door. In this weirdly strange voice, he said, ma'am, is this yours? When I looked at his hands, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-like looking device that was about 1.5 feet in length. It was very old, covered with rust. Yet on one end had these tiny circular small finger holes, as if it was a mix of a thin, long sword and scissors, oddly combined together. I remember being kind of amazed, not frightened, and asked where he found them. "They were under your hood," he replied. I said just a matter-of-factly that I'd never seen them before. How weird is it that those things had somehow been stuck there, undiscovered in my car for all those years? I shook my head in surprise. He just stood there, staring at them, unbelievingly. Then he looked oddly pale as well, like he couldn't find the right words to speak for a little bit, and just stared at the object. Honestly, especially in the moment, I didn't care one bit about it. All I could think about was getting the car going, letting me pay, and leaving. He didn't say anything else, just set them on the curb. Then went over and started his truck, then signaled for me to start my Jeep. It immediately caught, and my 3-year-old cheered, grateful. I quickly turned on the air conditioner, full blast, rolled up all the windows, and aimed those vents back towards the back seat. I reached for my purse to pay out, stood up and took a few steps to meet him, so I could hear about how much I owed him. With both of our vehicles running now, he came back over to the driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, he walked right past me, picked up that weird object once more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at these one more time," then held them out for a closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer, and I actually really looked. In his hands, that item still appeared to be incredibly large, possessing an almost like bayonet-looking quality, except for those strange 2 small loops on one end, and I definitely had never seen anything like it, and I told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly and slowly to me, as if desperately trying to make me understand that something was still going over my head. These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine, ma'am. They couldn't have been there for very long at all because they were sitting, well, right on top. They had to have been just put there." I shook my head and half smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty, look at them." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but you see how sharp they are? They look like they'd just been sharpened." When I looked down, he was indeed correct. The long, skinny dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest thing about them was definitely how sharp they were. The edges of the tip where the rust had been removed were gleaming silver. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "Ma'am, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me and took the payment, told me that I probably needed to call the police when I got home, then asked me where I wanted that item. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't really want to take it at all, honestly, but I released the back window so we could place it in the very back. We both then left the lot together, him turning one way and me the other. I did indeed contact the Macon police the moment that we arrived home. Although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the scissor-like thing to them later. The officer I spoke to said they sounded like they were specialized surgical shears, at least from my description and the measurements on the phone. As you can imagine, I remember wondering how or why he would even know that. I tried carefully not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping they might still be able to lift prints or test it for blood if they wanted to. But my story was seemingly boring him a bit, and he didn't seem too much interested in doing so. His attitude insinuated that there was no longer an emergency, so it was no longer of any importance. At the very end of the call, as if to wind things down, he did say it sounded like I was very lucky, and that I might want to keep those shears for a few days, just in case somebody from his office got back with me later. But that was pretty much it. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper and placed them in the brick storage unit behind our house. And there they remained for several more years, untouched, until we moved away and I finally, not wanting to bring them across several states, reluctantly threw them in the trash. Around that time though, if you look through the old newspaper reports, women were going missing all over Georgia. Some bodies were eventually being found, but others remain missing to this very day. I've often wondered what could have happened if that service station attendant hadn't arrived when he did. If my children would still have a mother. If I would still have my son and daughter. If I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never truly know, but I did in fact learn something important about myself that day. I always felt like I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people and staying safe. But because I was exhausted and tired and hot, stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a bit. It wasn't working at the time. Many of my friends and family still think that our car trouble that day and my lack of awareness could have easily cost us our lives.